In the mid-2000s, the Star Trek franchise was not in a good place. The 2002 theatrical release of the film Star Trek Nemesis did not meet expectations, and the sole ongoing television series at the time, Star Trek Enterprise, was cancelled in 2005 with an ending that was unsatisfying to many viewers. Fans at the time really thought this was the end of Star Trek, that it had run its course and there wouldn't be any new shows or movies after that. However, in 2009, Star Trek did come back, in a way that it never had before, as a complete reboot of the original series. I won't deny that it did bring attention back to the franchise, but narrative speaking, I just don't think it really works all that well. I'll explain my thoughts in this video. The 3 Star Trek films created and produced by J.J. Abrams were Star Trek, often referred to as Star Trek 2009 to avoid confusion, Star Trek Into Darkness, and Star Trek Beyond. These were the 11th through 13th Star Trek films overall and take place in an alternate timeline, a phenomenon which the Star Trek universe had long established the existence of. We actually see the creation of this timeline from the so-called Prime Timeline, and it happens through none other than Spock, the Prime Timeline version of him anyway. Because the new timeline branched off during events that occurred on board the USS Kelvin, the new timeline came to be known as the Kelvin Timeline, as referenced in the title of this video. So, how exactly was this new timeline created, and what were the consequences of it? Well, in the year 2387 of the Prime Universe, the star of the planet Romulus was about to go supernova. The elderly Spock Prime, who was on Romulus at the time as an ambassador, attempted to use a substance called red matter to absorb the supernova and save the planet. However, he was pursued by the Romulan Nero, and Spock failed to stop the supernova, instead creating a black hole which took him and Nero back in time. Nero was taken to the year 2233 when James Kirk's parents, George and Winona Kirk, were aboard the USS Kelvin, Winona at the time 7 months pregnant with James. Nero attacked the ship, which resulted in George dying, James being born premature, and the ship being destroyed. Since these events were different in the Prime Timeline, where George never died and James was born in Iowa 2 months later, the ensuing events created a tangential alternate timeline. One of my main issues with the Kelvin Timeline movies is the attempt to create and pass off alternate versions of existing and well-established characters. From a production standpoint, I can somewhat understand the reason for doing this. They wanted to use character concepts that people were already familiar with from the original series, which they probably thought would entice more people to see the movies rather than trying to create truly original characters for these stories. Here's the thing though, the alternate reality characters in these movies really aren't very much like their Prime counterparts, at least not enough to be very convincing. Of course, alternate James Kirk's life was changed by his dad having died on the day he was born, but I just have a hard time believing that he would have been that different of a person because of this one event. The James Kirk of the Prime universe went through significantly more trauma and still didn't have the problematic behaviors that his supposed counterpart does. I guess the writers thought that the OG Kirk story of being a stack of books with legs would be too boring. Although the Prime version of Spock does have repressed emotions, the kind of anger shown by alternate Spock is almost never there. Spock Prime's hidden emotions have much more to do with sadness and sympathy. Alternate Spock did have the life-changing event of his home planet being destroyed, but once again, I don't think it would make him such a radically different character. Even when alternate Spock was a child, before the destruction of Vulcan, he lashed out against his bullies in anger rather than simply defending himself, different from how Spock Prime was depicted as a child. From a creative standpoint, it really just makes it seem like they wrote alternate versions of existing characters so that they didn't have to make the effort to come up with new ones. That actually leads me to another point I wanted to talk about, the storyline of Vulcan being destroyed. It's the biggest of many reasons why I'm relieved that these movies are set in an alternate timeline that has no effect on the Prime universe. It was unreasonable and ridiculous for Nero to want to destroy Vulcan as revenge for Spock not being able to save Romulus because Nero did absolutely nothing to try to help Spock. The destruction of Vulcan really seems like it was done for shock value rather than genuinely adding something significant to the narrative. With Vulcan being a founding member of the Federation and 6 billion people killed by its destruction, the implications are huge, yet they're never explored in depth in either this or either of the next 2 movies, apart from a new colony being established for the mere 10,000 or so survivors. Compare an event of such magnitude to the burn as depicted in Star Trek Discovery. That series spends a whole season covering the aftermath, even though it takes place 120 years after the actual event. A trilogy of movies has less runtime than a season of a show, but if they weren't going to devote the appropriate amount of time and storytelling to that event, they shouldn't have written it in at all. I think it would have made a much more compelling story if the heroes had saved the planet instead, and them failing to only made it depressing. As for the Romulan supernova, those take decades if not centuries to form, so if one was happening right near the Romulan homeworld, they'd have known about it well in advance. Maybe it could be passed off as the Romulan authorities just not telling anyone, including their own citizens, because of the prevalence of secrets in Romulan culture. A single supernova would also not threaten the galaxy when it's only one of at least 100 billion stars in it. Destroying 2 different planets, though in 2 different realities, in the same movie really makes it seem like the writers don't have much respect for the Star Trek universe's alien cultures. Back to the characters, I really think they could have told the story they wanted to tell with original characters instead of passing off the ones they wrote as alternate counterparts. Even if those potential original characters were obvious one-to-one allegories of established ones, I still think that would have gone over better. In other words, the characters could have been written exactly as they are without being given the names and relatively similar appearances to the characters from the Prime universe. It would have also given them the opportunity to have more gender, race, and species diversity in the main cast. Like, why not make one of them an Andorian woman, for example? By using new takes on existing characters, they're really just telling stories that have already been told, just in a slightly different way. The first movie of this trilogy had several characters do very unreasonable things. I didn't understand why Kelvin timeline Spock marooned Kirk instead of just putting him in the brig, and most of Spock Prime's actions didn't make any sense to me at all. I couldn't believe that he would insist that Kirk force Spock out of the position of acting captain just because commanding the Enterprise was Kirk's destiny. For one thing, Prime Timeline Kirk was significantly older and more experienced than this Kirk when he took command, and once they freed Pike from the Romulans, there was no reason why Pike couldn't continue to be the Enterprise's captain. Having served under Pike for 11 years, Spock Prime would know this. Also, where the hell is my girl number 1? And what about Robert April, the actual first captain of the Enterprise? Spock Prime definitely wouldn't insist Kirk provoke Spock into an emotional reaction, since Vulcans are so much physically stronger than humans. I also didn't see any reason for anyone to believe that alternate Spock wasn't fit for command. Sure, he just lost his mother and his entire planet, but there were other ways to make that assessment or get him to admit it to himself. Finally, I get that Spock Prime felt responsible for the events of this alternate timeline, but I don't think he would break the temporal Prime directive so readily by telling everyone about what was supposed to happen in the future. It's like he was written as being senile or something, especially when he told Kelvin Kirk that it was nice to see him again, despite him very much not being the same person Spock Prime knew. The second movie of the trilogy, Star Trek Into Darkness, is a very thinly veiled retelling of the second Star Trek movie set in the Prime universe, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. On that note, casting a generic white guy actor in the role of a character named Khan Noonien Singh was just a really poor and frankly racist choice. If they really wanted Benedict Cumberbatch to play the villain in this story, they could have used any number of other characters from the original timeline, like Gary Mitchell, as has been suggested. Or, like with the main cast, they could have created an entirely new character to be the villain. They did it for the first movie. This movie also included an alternate version of Carol Marcus, and it did not treat her character well. It's like, we get it. She and Kirk canonically had sex in another universe. I almost found it kind of funny that the movie showed how Starfleet is just now realizing that giving a young, inexperienced officer fresh out of the academy like Kirk the flagship wasn't a good idea. I mean, he put the starship in the ocean, for crying out loud. Spock Prime seems to have also just recently decided that giving the characters information about the future isn't something he should be constantly doing. Spock Prime's hair is randomly black again instead of gray. I have a feeling that Leonard Nimoy probably wanted and was meant to have a bigger role in this film's story, but his illness at the time made his appearance reduced to a single scene, which makes me sad to think about. I thought it was ridiculous for Spock Prime to claim that Khan was the greatest threat that the Enterprise ever faced in his universe. I mean, sure, there was the Genesis device, but did the writers of this movie forget about the Planet Killer, Giant Amoeba, and Vampire Cloud? Spock wouldn't consider Khan the greatest threat just because the fight against Khan caused Spock specifically to die, whereas the other things I mentioned destroyed entire ships, crews, and even planets. Also, what is the title Star Trek Into Darkness even supposed to mean? If the plot had been something like the Voyager episodes Night or The Void, then I could understand. I think they were probably just trying to be edgy. It was 2013 after all. This alternate universe has many impractical things, namely the women's Starfleet uniforms, which are sleeveless and therefore don't display rank, and the apparent lack of inertial dampeners on shuttles to the point where they can make their occupants sick to their stomachs. There are also plenty of seemingly impossible things that are never explained, like transwarp beaming. That isn't even a thing in the 32nd century of the Prime universe, as far as we know anyway. Captain Pike, as he appears in these films, is just a prick, which I'm really glad they didn't do with his appearances in Discovery and Strange New Worlds. Otherwise, I think those shows would just be unwatchable. Speaking of Discovery, it seems that the infamous visual redesign of the Klingons for that show may have actually been inspired by how they look in this movie. As for this Pike, the only really emotional aspect of his death scene was Zachary Quinto's acting, and since this Spock wouldn't have served under Pike for so many years, I didn't really get why he'd be so devastated. It's nowhere near as compelling as what Spock does for Pike in the original series, taking an enormous personal risk to deliver Pike to the Talosians. Considering how many problems I found with the first and second movies in this trilogy, Star Trek Beyond surprised me by being, honestly, pretty good. That probably had a lot to do with it being written and directed by different people than the ones from the first two films. I liked the plot point of the characters being divided up into pairs who each work together to solve pieces of the greater problem. It reminded me a lot of Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, which is still uncontestedly the best Star Trek movie of all time. I think Leonard Nimoy would be satisfied with the way his character's off-screen death was handled because it was very respectful towards him. As for the character of Spock Prime, it makes me happy to think that he can finally rest and be with his friends again, since there is good reason to believe that an afterlife exists in the Star Trek universe. Another thing that Beyond did, which I liked, was confirm that the Makos were disbanded, and since the date given for that event was before the timeline diverged, that makes it canon to the Prime universe as well. I never liked the Makos anyway. I didn't think they fit in amongst Starfleet the way they were portrayed in Star Trek Enterprise. There was also the nice little touch of all the different main characters, each saying part of the classic Star Trek opening narration at the end of the movie. Because the plot of Star Trek Beyond is not a direct result of the alternate reality, it wouldn't be exclusive to this series. It could have happened with any crew, even in the Prime universe, and at any point in the timeline. That's not necessarily a negative thing. It's probably another reason why this movie was better than the other two, but it made me wish more than ever that these characters had just been original ones created for this film series, rather than supposed alternate versions of long-established existing ones. It's in the same way that I wish Michael Burnham hadn't been made Spock's adoptive sister so that she could more easily stand on her own as a character. It would have allowed the characters to develop more organically, and since this film was the one that made me care enough about these characters to want to see them do so, I guess it just made me especially aware of that. For one thing, it would make alternate Spock saying that he wanted to live as Spock Prime did more meaningful, because as it is, of course you'd want to live as he did, Spock. He's you from the future. Overall, there are some aspects of these movies' stories that are at least somewhat interesting and do have some merit to them. Seeing an older Spock act as a mentor to his younger self is reminiscent of the Star Trek The Animated Series episode Yesteryear, in which Spock travels back in time to assist his younger self. The scene of young Spock being bullied by his schoolmates, then choosing to fight back, is definitely a direct reference to that episode, right down to the bullies calling Spock's father a traitor for marrying a human. As I mentioned, it's really only young Spock's response that's significantly different. I also don't blame the writers for wanting to retell Kirk and Spock's story in particular, given the way that it ended in the Prime timeline with the events of the film Star Trek Generations. I made an entire video on why I hated what that movie did. I can also see the appeal of wanting to follow the characters during the years of their lives before the events of the original series, or the equivalent of that in this timeline, but I think the series Star Trek Strange New Worlds and even Star Trek Discovery did so in a much more satisfying way, in the Prime universe this time. One thing I didn't like was alternate Kirk and Spock seemingly only becoming friends because Spock Prime told them it was meant to happen. I think it would have been more meaningful to have the characters come together on their own than by having an older alternate version of one of them suggested and ultimately set it in motion. They could have even just framed it as Spock Prime saying they should be friends because it would change their lives in a way that one of his friendships once did, without him mentioning who that friend was, instead of him just essentially saying that they're meant to be friends just because of who they are specifically. There's also another way that alternate Kirk and Spock coming together could have happened that would have also fixed one of the biggest problems with Star Trek Generations. Since Spock Prime being pulled into the alternate reality happened in part through time travel, those mechanics could have been used to bring back the Prime version of James Kirk. If they could come up with a way to explain the creation of the alternate timeline, I'm sure they could have factored in some way of bringing him into it too, especially since the nexus from Generations is never even really properly explained. Whether or not alternate Kirk and Spock knew who Kirk Prime was, them witnessing a heartfelt reunion between him and Spock Prime could have shown them how special a friendship could be. At the time that the 2009 movie was being made, William Shatner was willing to return to the role of Kirk, but only wanted his character to be in the movie if it was a major appearance instead of the minor cameo planned but later deleted. If this did happen, I think Kirk Prime would feel compelled to lecture Kelvin Kirk on how to respect women like he did with Charlie Evans in TOS. As it is, with Spock Prime grieving for Kirk Prime twice, once when everyone thought he was dead and then when he was actually dead, him failing to save Romulus, and watching Vulcan be destroyed, that feels like too much tragedy for one character. After a certain point, any more just kinda loses its meaning and impact. I suppose it was nice to see him finally embrace his human side to the extent that he encouraged his alternate self to do the same, but a story with additional trauma for him wasn't the only way to make that happen. There's a good reason why one common name for these movies is the Alternate Original Series, or AOS. It's because it's practically attached to the original series with a tractor beam and can't stand on its own, relying on people's previous knowledge of the franchise and its characters to even be made. To me, trying to reboot something like Star Trek in that way really just seems a lot like trying to reinvent the wheel. These movies could have even been their own Star Trek adjacent sci-fi series. Overall, I see the Kelvin timeline films as a transitional period for the franchise, a bout of growing pains that it just had to power through in order to get to the next phase of its evolution and development. Despite my qualms with these movies, I do acknowledge that they have their place in the Star Trek franchise and almost certainly saved it from total oblivion. It's unlikely there would have been enough interest to create any of the newer Star Trek series, most of which are pretty good, if it weren't for these movies bringing Star Trek back into the popular consciousness when they did. I think there's still a possibility that these movies, being their own franchise, could have renewed interest in Star Trek since it's all sci-fi, though a lot of people became Trekkies and came to love that franchise as a whole once these movies introduced them to it. Additionally, Leonard Nimoy saw something in these movies enough to want to be part of them. He knew Star Trek very well and knew Spock even better, so I trust his judgment on something like this, even if I don't understand or agree with it. I suppose the Kelvin timeline film trilogy must have something to offer, but whatever it is, it just doesn't appeal to me. As with anything else though, if you like it, good for you. So what do you think of Star Trek's Kelvin timeline? Do you agree with any of my opinions on it? How do you believe this film trilogy compares to the series it was meant to be based on, or to any other Star Trek series? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching this video. I've got others on Star Trek and also plenty of other media you may be into, so be sure to check those out. Live long and prosper, and I'll see you next time.